Yeah.
helping them through sin rather than rejecting it completely. And we also talked about how he would also address suffering, that as an American culture, we tend to try to avoid it at all costs, but I think
Hmm.
Peter would encourage us instead to find to understand how to suffer rather than make fun of it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. That's good.
I would love a letter on politics.
Yeah, same.
The church's response
Yeah.
to living. Um, I guess I see it the same way they had to respond to Roman civilization. What is our position in response
Hmm.
in a culture that is extremely divided?
Oh gosh, yeah. Yeah, that would be.
I just love a letter. Don't even write
Someone is gonna write her a letter, please, this afternoon. Yeah, no, these are all awesome. I love all the things that you guys came up with, because I think the reason why I asked this question, and I was kind of hoping we'd go that direction, and we in some way did, but a lot of the things that you guys addressed is things Peter is addressing in this letter. And as I was studying it, I was like, wow, this letter touches on all the important things. Like, it touches on suffering, it touches on persecution, it touches on humility, sanctification. What does eternity look like? What does the kingdom look like? It's kind of like almost like I'm not sure if they mentioned that when you guys studied Romans, like you say like, oh, it's Christianity 101. It's kind of like everything that you need to know about Christianity and the gospel. And I in some way feel even like, oh, Peter is almost like a mini version of Christianity 101, and say like, for like a whole year, all he can study is only Peter. Like, he touches on all the important things of Christianity and of the Christian walk. And so it's a really, really important book for us to study and spend time on. And there's so much depth to it that I barely even scratch the surface studying and to teach. And I mean, you guys will probably be in the same shoes as well, because you only have 2 days. But like, he goes in such depth with each topic, like with like about sanctification, humility, like the whole like code of conduct, how to live within a household and family and with slaves and everything, how to like authorities and politics. Like, he goes in such depth with it and gives you such like eloquent answers. So I think it's like such a cool book to study and spend more time in, and to find a lot of answers that are still super relevant in our days. But beside all of that, beside all of these topics that Peter is talking about, I think just in itself, Peter as a character is fascinating. And I'm not sure if you guys have spent much time looking at him, maybe when you've studied Acts or some of the Gospels. But his life is like kind of like this, almost like this example of like, what does a transformation by the Holy Spirit looks like? Because for a lot of his life, or not for a lot of his life, but for the life of Jesus, he was always the one on his side. He has firsthand experienced actually what life with Christ looks like, and he has firsthand experienced what the transformation looks like and what it looks like to be commissioned by him. And what I think is so cool, what Peter does, he shares his understanding of the kingdom of God, what it looks like to live in the kingdom, and he brings it from a point of view where we can, with the gospel and with Acts, we can kind of like see his mess ups, and then with Peter, we see almost like his reconciliation of understanding of like what does it actually look like, and kind of like him coming to understanding of like, oh, actually that's what it looks like. And like in Mark, we get a lot of examples of his downfalls, and it's kind of like Mark is like almost like the gospel according to Peter. We believe that Mark wrote it with the help of Peter, and so just his life, you can track it through the New Testament, and you can see so many like ways how his letter kind of like almost like reflects some of the things that he has done or either done wrong, and then he kind of corrects it. So we'll go into this later on today, but I think it's fascinating. I think it's an amazing book. I think Peter is amazing, and I'm really excited to just talk about him today. Does anyone have a question? Does anyone, I don't know, say any initial thoughts about the book? Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that this time, this letter is not really addressing one specific church, but more like several regions.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering like how we'll approach studying that in
Yeah, we'll definitely talk about that. Yeah.
Was the letter like written in response to the dispersion?
What do you mean with that?
Well, it's to like the churches after they were all dispersed, right?
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, like, why Peter wrote it.
Yeah.
If it was, I mean, I guess I couldn't might be our either reason, but I don't know if there was a specific reason, or.
We'll touch on it. I'm not sure if I can exactly give you the answer to it, but I will touch on like the dispersion, why he used maybe even that term. Yeah. And then at the end, kind of like neatly summarize into a package of like original readers.
Yeah, I guess I had an interesting thought of wondering about Peter writing it through the person at the end. He said, like, because he wasn't like. I guess I don't know how academic, like how much academic ability Peter had.
Yeah.
How much the writer like put to language things Peter was saying. And I was like, if Peter had the ability to write a letter like Paul did, or
Yeah. Yeah, we'll touch on that as well. Great questions. Any others? Perfect. Well, this is our first session. Let's have a quick break. You guys can fill up your coffee, grab water, go to the bathroom, and let's. Yeah, great. Maybe be back in like 4 minutes, at like 10. You guys do morning, like tea break or morning tea at 10:30, right? Should we just do it now? Is that okay? Is that okay? Okay, perfect. Yeah, great, awesome.
Time moves in rhythm with his hand, booming bound.
right, thanks so much. Okay, it's working. All right, let's talk about author and answer some of your questions, who he is, what he has done, who wrote it, who is Sylvanus, and all these things. With like authorship, if it's not too debated, I'm pretty straightforward of just like, well, 1:1, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. It says it, like he's the author. And I must say, like, it hasn't actually been debated, his authorship, until kind of like 100, 200 years ago, where you probably noticed this even when you were doing BRIs, a lot of authorship has been started being debated around 200 years ago and has never been debated earlier on. I don't really know. I think people started maybe to think critically or started to question it. I don't really know. I think it's really interesting looking at like what church fathers say about authorship, because like we can actually really just rely often on the statement of the church fathers, because sometimes they actually have done life with them, or they have lived a generation after, so it was kind of still like within like often like, oh, like yeah, that person knew them and they said they wrote it, and so then they wrote it down, wrote a book about it or something, or mentioned it in one of their writings. So I'm not really sure what kind of like resources that you guys are using, but often if they mention like church fathers, like that's kind of like a very good point to take as well. And I feel like often like when it's very debated, that's kind of like the point of view that I'm taking. Also, I'm not a theologian. I haven't studied theology. I'm like 3 weeks into my studies, so I just don't have much to debate about until I maybe study more, and then I can correct it. But often like I really do trust what kind of like church history has to say about it. But I still want to mention kind of like the point that the people are making of kind of the opposing side, saying like, oh yeah, there's no way Peter wrote it. And what they were saying is like, well, Peter was a fisherman. There's no way he writes a letter with a Greek that is that eloquent. Because if you would look at the Greek of the letter, like it's fantastic. It's fantastic Greek. It's very high quality. It is not common for just a fisherman to be speaking or writing in such a great Greek. And same with, like, you will notice it with 2 Peter as well. It's the same debate again. But what people are saying is, like, there's a possibility, a high possibility, that actually Sylvanus wrote it for him. So he was kind of like just sitting at his little desk, and Peter was telling him, like, hey, I want to talk about these things. Let's put this into words. So that's a big chance that actually it happened like that. Yeah. But nevertheless, like the content and everything that he's talking about is still from Peter. It's still from his heart. It's still from his life experience that he had with Christ. Yeah. All right. Something interesting that Peter is saying in chapter 5, verse 1. So he says, so I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder and a witness to the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory going to be revealed. What do you think Peter is referring to when he says, like, he's a witness to the sufferings of Christ? Like, what does this even imply? Why would he mention that? Yeah.
In the garden, like all those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you think this adds? Him saying this, what does this add to the letter? Authority, yeah. 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 Credibility, especially like a letter that is so heavily talking about suffering, like he actually can talk about it, I feel like. And he can talk about it on behalf of Jesus as well, because he has seen it all. And I feel like that's what he does a lot. Like he always talks about the sufferings and our part, or like the readers partaking in the suffering because Jesus has suffered. And so, yeah, kind of like just to give him authority within that. But yeah, Peter has really seen what Jesus has been through. And this passage, but also so many other passages within the book kind of like refer to that. So for example, there is this passage in chapter 5, verse 5, he says, clothe yourself, all of you, with humility toward one another. And I'm thinking about like, oh, was maybe when like Peter wrote this, was he thinking about when actually Jesus was with all the apostles and washing their feet, like wrapping a towel around his waist and washing all their feet, and like, okay, this is what humility looks like. Or in chapter 5, verse 2, he says, shepherd the flock of God that is among you. And where have we heard that before? Or where has maybe Peter heard that before? Yeah, like Jesus literally told him. Like he asks him like 3 times, hey, Peter, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And then he repeats 3 times of basically like, hey, take care of my sheep, tend my sheep. And so like we see a lot of equivalence to the teachings of Jesus that I will touch on kind of like later on as well. But it doesn't seem like when we look at the life of him, of Peter's life, but also what he's writing, it doesn't just seem like, oh, he's just saying these things because he heard, like just for whatever reason. But I feel like the more I studied it, like it really comes from a point of like, wow, he's saying these things because he experienced these things. Like he has firsthand experienced how Jesus has done life, how he has interacted with other people, and what does it actually look like to die at the cross and then to be resurrected, but also then like what does this mean now relate to him? Like what does this mean for the grace that he has received? How does sanctification look like? And all this process, like he's talking from like life experience, from actual like, hey, I know what I'm talking about. And he has so much authority and credibility to talk about these things. And he has just really done heart to heart with Christ. At the end, like literally probably falling on his knees in humility, and it's like, I'm so sorry, I've messed up big time. And then we kind of like see his rise within the book of Acts, written about like what he does there with like the incredible preachings that he has, the incredible things he says, when kind of like in the gospel, he was not really portrayed as like the best and like the most faithful guy, I would say. But he really has a comeback, and I'm excited to talk about it. Okay, so the next thing that I want to do, I mentioned that before, I kind of like want to do like this character study about Peter, like who he is, and kind of like where has he come from, to a point of like, okay, who is he as? Like he is, he's incredible. He's so relatable. Yeah, he had his shortcomings, but he really tried hard to communicate like what does the kingdom look like, and really to work hard for the kingdom. And so, did you guys watch The Chosen? Have you guys seen it? Peter is, I tried to find a clip of him, and there was just a lot, and they were too long and would have taken too much time. But I'm not sure if you guys remember like the scene where he is on the lake by himself at night, kind of like just like fighting with God, and then his other boat comes like, hey, who are you talking to? And I feel like that is such a good picture of who Peter is, because he's kind of like wrestling with Christ, doesn't really understand it. And also like, I mean, imagine like just throwing away all basically your life to like follow Christ, like all that gives him security. And I feel like through his life, we see like this tension that he lived with of like, oh, is it really worth it, like committing everything to life with Christ? Because like kind of like the security, and we see him like, he struggles with kind of like staying faithful to Christ throughout. But anyways, I'll go into it. I just wanted to like give you a brief, like why I showed this picture, because I think Peter is so well depicted within the show, kind of like what we can even observe within the Gospels and in Acts. Yeah, and so Peter's really like this example of what it looks like when you actually let Jesus in and let him transform your life, let him soften your heart. And yeah, we'll go into it. So, oh yeah, I wanted to mention this. You will probably notice that there's moments where what he actually says in the gospel, it almost like doesn't fully line up with how we see his life again, or what we observed in his life in the gospel and in Acts. For example, like when he actually in this letter says like rejoice in suffering. But what we see in in the gospel, when Jesus tells him like, hey, I'm actually going to die, like he is the one who is the first one to rebuke him. And then again, the same thing when he says like, hey, do not repay evil for evil, but he was the first one who cut off the servant's ear in the garden. So like just kind of like these pictures of like how he has been transformed and how he actually takes probably his life lessons that he has learned into then teaching his audience. So who Peter is. Peter was can you read this wall? Is that good? Okay. I'll make sure for Wednesday, I'm going to change it, but I can also send out the PowerPoint to you guys, so that will be helpful as well, because there's like verse references on it, so you guys can look at it as well when you guys are studying. Sorry about the small. Great. Okay, that would be awesome. All right. So Peter, he was a fisherman from Capernaum. His brother was Andrew, and when they were the first disciples that were called, and so they literally left everything they had. And throughout the gospel, you will kind of like notice his like character traits. Like he is like, I would say he's enthusiastic, a little bit like strong-willed, impulsive, and short-tempered as well. And he doesn't always seem like to be like the smartest guy, maybe. Like when he wants to like build a tent for them on Mount of Transfiguration, was like, what are you saying? Why are you doing this? But Peter was a disciple throughout the whole ministry of Jesus, literally always there. And we often see him like as being like almost like the leader and the spokesperson for all the other apostles and the other disciples. He was the first one who confessed that Jesus is the Christ. And together with James and John, he was kind of like in this innermost circle of Jesus, kind of like his best friends. He was entrusted with very important moments in Jesus' life. And yeah, so he had a very like deep insight into what the holy life of Christ kind of like looks like, even like being on the Mountain of Transfiguration and so on. As I mentioned, he's kind of like an impulsive person, acts hasty. He walked on water, but the moment he kind of like took his eyes off Jesus, like he was starting to sink. He was the one who rebuked Jesus that I mentioned already. He wanted to build tents for Moses and Elijah. He was the one who cut off the servant's ear. He said, hey, I would never forsake you, Christ. I would never forsake you, but he was the first one who denied him 3 times as well. And so kind of like through the ups and downs of his life, he was still always staying at his side, at Jesus' side. And it was really cool because even though he had all these ups and downs, at the end of Jesus' life, he almost like his ministry is being reaffirmed by Jesus, of like telling him like, hey, I still make you like the rock of the church, and you will play a very important and foundational role within the building of the church in this area. And I think that is so special, like that he was specifically commissioned by Jesus. Like we don't have this with anyone else. And even though we have the most downfalls written down from a person like they're about Peter, he was the one who was specifically commissioned by Jesus to build the church. And so I think that's really interesting as well to consider of like, oh, like, I mean, how easy is it for us to like kind of like be like beaten up by like, I don't know, like our downfalls and by our shortcomings, but that literally has nothing to do with what Jesus wants to do with our lives and how he wants to use us. And Peter is the most relatable example for that. As I mentioned, he was very foundational with building the church in Acts. And he was kind of like present when 3 very important people groups kind of like received the gospel. So first, he was the main speaker at Pentecost. He was present when the Holy Spirit came to Samaria. And he was present when Cornelius, the first Gentile, received the Holy Spirit. And so 3 groups of people receiving the gospel. First the Jews, then at Pentecost, and the Samaritans, and then the Gentiles. And he was present in every instance. throughout Peter's life, even though he was an apostle and he was doing really great work, and especially in Acts we see that he was still kind of like having like these growing pains, and he's like growing pains, downfalls, shortcomings. Because, for example, like at first when he got asked or like told to bring the gospel to Cornelius, a Gentile, he refused. He didn't want to do it. But then also something that we see was so he was having dinner with the Gentiles, and then like Jews were walking by, and suddenly he started like acting hypocritically. And so again, like kind of like contradict his message that he was actually preaching. And then, later on in his life, we have all these things kind of like recorded as well, like about his life and where he was like spending time with Mark, and Mark was writing the gospel, kind of like based on his witnessing. And I think it's just interesting how like, Peter experienced like so much, and we literally see every aspect of his life. Again, knowing then this letter, kind of like what it talks about here. And you will notice this more when you study it, actually. And that's kind of like why I wanted to give you this like overview of his life, because you will notice when you're studying this letter, like there's so many things that kind of like, oh, like he's literally addressing something that he has done wrong, or he is addressing something that he actually didn't live by for a time in his life, and kind of like just like seeing like redemption coming through that and shining through this. We know from, and I will talk about this more on Wednesday, but from the Apocrypha, we know that actually Jesus dies upside down on a cross. And that's something Jesus has, did I say Jesus dies upside down on a cross? Peter is dying upside down on a cross. And that's something we know, like even like Jesus told him specifically, hey, like you will die a martyr's death. And I'm not really sure why he told him this. It's kind of like not the most encouraging thing to tell him at the end before he leaves. But and so we know from the Apocrypha as well, like that he actually died upside down on a cross, because it was like, I'm not worthy to die the same way that my Savior died. I'll talk more about the Apocrypha on Wednesday, which is kind of like Jude, 2 Peter, weird books, weird references in there. But that's kind of like what we know about the end of his life, that at the end of his life, he lived in Rome, and he died under the persecution of Nero. And kind of like to summarize this all up, I kind of like wanted to give you a couple of like statements, say timeless truths, just like kind of like things that we can learn from Peter's life. So the first thing is, it's so small, but Jesus overcomes fear. So when Peter first like didn't want to walk on water, like he kind of like at the end eventually stepped out because Jesus was there. So that's kind of like the first statement that we maybe can learn from Peter's life, of that Jesus does overcome fear. I think a big one is that Jesus forgives unfaithfulness. Peter really like it seemed like he burned the bridges in the courtyard where he denied Jesus, and then really like when Jesus came back resurrected, like he went to Jesus and kind of like rebuilt these bridges and was like, hey, I'm going to use you and you're forgiven, and kind of like gives him like this first-hand experience of like what that's actually the grace looks like, the grace from our resurrected Jesus. Then Jesus is really patient, and he patiently teaches. We see this with Peter so many times, where he corrects him, where he literally just like when they don't get it, who he actually is, like he just continues to kind of like invest into their life. And I mean, I feel like this is very relatable. Like I feel like Jesus is very patient with me. I need his patience. I think if I wouldn't have his patience and his patient teaching, like I wouldn't know where I would be at right now. But I'm grateful that he has the endurance and the patience for me. Jesus sees us, he sees people as he intends them to be. And so Peter was just a fisherman, but Jesus saw him as the foundation of the church. And so he saw something way different, like not even Peter saw this within himself. And then kind of like the whole like story of all the apostles, like Jesus uses unlike heroes. He's using people who are just don't fit into the picture that, or didn't fit the expectation that probably a lot of the Jews had of like who's actually the ones who are bringing the kingdom. And so that's a very cool thing to even see within Peter's story as well, of just like how he really didn't fit the picture, and he had probably the most downfalls, but yet like he was so very foundational. And now we have this letter. Yeah, there is truly a whole teaching that I could spend on his life. I would love to dive more into all of these sections about his life and talk more about like who he was, what he has done, what we can learn from every single aspect. I would love to hear from you guys how you guys maybe think it even relates to your personal life. But through studying this, specifically this session, I really got a glimpse of what Peter was like, and it really, really helped me understanding where he comes from with his letter, because I feel like when I first started studying, I kind of like was a little confused of like, why is he touching on all of these things? Like, he talks about sanctification, humility, and then he talks about suffering. I didn't really feel like they meshed together really well. You maybe have felt that as well when you read it, but I feel like knowing now his life and what he has been through and what he has like experienced, I'm like, oh, like it actually makes sense that he's touching on these things, because each of them have been so foundational in his life and in his ministry. And so the Gospels and Acts really give us like this beautiful insight into the transformation that happened in Peter's life. And I think for me, kind of like the main word that I came up with, or that kind of came to me as I was just like preparing, was like perspective. Peter really wants to gain his readers' perspective about life, perspective about the kingdom. What does it look like? What does perspective look like in light of suffering? What does perspective of the kingdom look like in light of humility within your household and all of that? And so I will touch back on it quite a few times of just the word perspective, and see how Peter's giving us perspective into different areas of life and the Christian walk, because I feel like this book is so important for us today as it was then, because it gives us the perspective that we need, and it gives us the perspective to endure, because life is equally painful now than it was painful then. We just have, in some way, we experience different kind of pain, but also it's still the same fallen world. And I feel like Paul wants to give us a perspective of like, how do we actually live in this fallen world that is such a glimpse in eternity, like it is just a moment in time. And he really wants to show us this through this book. Does anyone have a question about Peter, about any of the things talked about? Great. That's kind of like it about the life of Peter. And then in the next session after the break, I'm going to talk about like the background and kind of like the message of the whole book. But yeah, if you guys have ever any question, like, or just come up, we can talk about it. Yeah, I really love talking about this book. I love talking about him. So, yeah, Whitney.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Based on maybe like when Peter wrote this, I know it's Paul. You could tell in some of his letters where he was at in life based on like style, words, all that.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts of like maybe what was going on in Peter's life when he was writing this?
Yeah. We'll talk about this a little bit in the next session, actually, when I talk about like the dating, just to kind of like give you like a framework where we are kind of like in time. I feel like 2 Peter gives us a very clear picture of it, because he says like, hey, I'm literally about to die. So it was kind of like his like last swan song of life. But yeah, I'll definitely will touch on it briefly in some sort. Okay, great. Yeah, let's do a break. How long is your break usually? Like 15 minutes?
I was like, bro,
They're bomb.
I was, yeah, I wasn't, yeah. I wasn't trying to like not ask, but I was, when I saw that, I was like, is he about to eat a bunch of caribou? So like that's everything I know Alex is about. Yeah, I feel like he's been like pretty healthy actually.
What has he become of late?
What has he been recently?
I think this past battle, they're or I won't say that's too soon. They're MEVJOR
Oh,
and yeah.
All right. Wow, this was the best morning tea I've ever had. This was truly incredible. Can't wait for Wednesday. All right, so talking about background, and I want to talk about the date written, and kind of like weaving into that, like who is the audience, and yeah, I'll sum it up all at the end. So I kind of like build on top of my argument to kind of like build a whole case. So I hope it all makes sense at the end. If not, I'm happy to like take all the questions that you guys are having. But yeah, it's just a bit, yeah, it's kind of like a lot to get into it and to really kind of like make sense of it. At least that's what I thought. But yeah, kind of like to understand like the specific things that Peter's addressing, it really helps us understanding obviously the date written. And kind of like from tradition and church history, and what you probably even like will notice within the books of like your background books, you will notice that the main two dates that they will give us or that you will see are either around 64 AD or 68. And so we definitely know from like history books that Peter died under the reign of Nero. He was martyred. Yeah, what do you know about Nero? What do you remember from like other books? He was the worst. Yeah, what kind of stuff did he do?
Stole from shops, Christians' lives.
Yeah. Yeah, he was literally crazy. Yeah, the worst of the worst. And his persecution was really intense. And what do you remember when his persecution started? The fire, yeah. When was that? Do you know when in 64? Yeah, I think it's June or July of 64. Yeah, great. Kind of like mid-year of 64. And that's kind of like important to consider just because of the dating written. Okay, so I have a few passages up here. Sorry, smaller ones. Do you want me to write them on the whiteboard? Would that help you? Or okay, okay, great. Okay, perfect. At your table, I want you to briefly look at these passages within Peter, and kind of like discuss what they're about, what it is saying about the suffering they're going through. All right. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but yeah, just kind of like more like as a type of exercise that you can do when you look at the reason written, and kind of like how you can maybe even come up with like of some sort of a statement, and to figure out, okay, what actually the issue was, because it's easy to say like, oh, he was suffering, and it was, if it's written around that time, it must be the Neronian persecution. It's easy to imply, but actually, when we kind of look at those and we are looking kind of like summarizing them, so we have suffering, various trials, tests of their faith, being spoken evil of, servants being harshly treated. He brings up Jesus' example of being abused and reviled, wives suffering under husbands, being abused, suffering for righteousness' sake, being abused and called to account for what they're believing, for their hope, suffering in the flesh, especially with the example of Jesus, a fiery ordeal to test them, reproached, rebuked, disgraced for the name of Christ. And so, what does this imply, do you think? Does it sound like the Neronian persecution of some sort? It does, do you think? Yeah. Yeah.
I read it, like even the when I read this, it was the first time I read the instructions to the wives as a form of suffering.
Yeah.
I had not read that before.
Yeah.
I'd seen it like that before. I just thought it was like, this is just what you gotta do. This is culture.
Yeah.
But this was the first time I saw it as him understanding
Mm-hmm.
what they had to live through and giving them instructions on how to endure it.
Yeah.
And I was like, I had never seen that.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting? Yes.
But then he was also writing to people all over, not just in Rome.
Yeah.
So it had to be more than just
Mm-hmm.
persecution.
Yeah. Exactly.
It's a lot like Gentiles or like persecution for being Christians from everyone else around them, even if it wasn't
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. Yeah. I really think like I feel like this persecution that Peter is specifically addressing is not on the large scale of the Neronian persecution. I think it hasn't quite kicked off yet. Because I feel like if he would have done so, he would have specifically mentioned more of like the suffering, the physical suffering as well. Because I feel like generally this is talking about a daily persecution, living as a Christian, living as a believer amidst unbelievers, like who oppose them, who like verbally abuse them. They can lose their job. They might be rejected. They might become outcasts. There probably maybe has been some physical harm or like physical suffering, maybe even death. But I think it's not quite to the extent that the persecution under Nero would have brought forth, because I feel like he would have used words more like under that, kind of comforting this kind of suffering that is so extreme and so like wild. So as I mentioned before, at the end of his life and during this time as well, Peter did live in Rome. And you maybe remember that from like Acts and some other books, but in the beginning, like Christianity was pretty accepted within the Roman Empire, because they actually considered Christianity some sort of like Jewish sect. And Judaism was fully accepted by the Roman government, by the Roman Empire. It was like considered like a religio, I don't even know, I forgot the word, but it was an accepted religion within the empire. But also the Romans slowly, then kind of like more time passes, realize, oh, actually like the Jews don't even like the Christians. So they got rejected by the Jews, and then the Romans noticed that. And so that's then when kind of like the Christian persecution started to like come up, and really like once kind of like Nero started to burn down Rome and blame the Christians for it, that's when it really kicked off of like, okay, the Christian persecution started within the whole empire. But for a long time, like Christians kind of like just lived within the empire. And I feel like right when Peter wrote this book, tension was rising, because he noticed, okay, like the Christians are kind of starting to become like, there's this tension between Roman Empire and them, and they're starting to be of some sort being persecuted, especially socially persecuted. And so I think it is written right before like summer 64, just because it's of the language that he's using, kind of when like tension was rising. Yeah, and so he saw like Peter, like specifically, like he saw the hardship that was coming, and he knew like, because he lived in Rome, and that's where if everything started there, he knew, okay, I need to write this letter into the like regions, and I need to kind of like prepare them, warn them, and give them the perspective that they need in order to endure it. Oh yeah, social persecution, the kind. Oh. Okay, who was it? Does anyone have a question about that? Like kind of like the dating? Does this make sense? Yeah.
I thought of like with Paul. I don't remember exactly when Paul had been beheaded. Would that have been like just prior to 64, or would that have been later?
To the letter written, I think it was later.
Okay.
I think Paul, I'm not sure what dates you guys taught. I think we did like 68, 67 AD of the beheading of Paul. Probably more likely kind of like when 2 Peter was written, but I'll go into that. Yes?
In the intro, when he references the dispersion,
Mm-hmm.
what was that?
I'll talk about it right now, actually. Great. No, good. I appreciate the bridging. All right, so the recipient of this letter, he says, to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, he is specifically addressing, like, there's like provinces within Asia Minor, like the northern province, western, southern, and eastern. And he's kind of like addressing all of these provinces in Asia Minor, which is modern day Turkey now. And it's interesting that he's addressing specifically those nations or those provinces, because the New Testament doesn't really contain any records of this area specifically being evangelized to. Like, we don't actually know that any apostles went there. We know they have received the gospel because they were present at Pentecost. They were there. And Paul never went there because he was specifically not allowed to go to Asia and Bithynia. And 1 Peter 1:12, if someone would like to read that. Yeah.
It was revealed to them that they were serving not themselves but you in regard to the things that have happened and announced to you for those who brought you good news by the Holy Spirit sent from heaven, things into which the Egyptians long to look.
Mm-hmm. So he's mentioning, like, to those who preach the good news to you. So we know someone went there and has preached the gospel, and they do not owe their salvation to Peter. And so what we know is written in early 64, it is in Asia Minor, and they already have received the gospel. They're already believers. They are like, it seems like even like the things, the way he addressing them, like they're quite established in their faith. But kind of like to take a step deeper, like what is their racial background? So knowing where they were from, what do you think was their background? Were they Jews? Were they Gentiles? Did you find any hints within the text that gives you like a clear insight into that? Yeah, skim through it real quick. Or even like if you've already seen it, if you already have some in mind, like just like yell them out.
To me, to be Jewish believers,
How come?
because he was giving them instructions on how to deal with the Gentiles.
Yeah.
I thought probably Jews as well, just with so many verse references to the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And just using a lot of their language that they would already know.
Yeah.
That's what I was going to say.
Number
Yeah.
9,
That's
you got,
talking about like,
sorry, go ahead.
no, like a lot of talk about the blood of Jesus and how he's a king, and a lot of references to Old Testament
Mm-hmm.
stuff as well.
Yeah.
In chapter 2, verse 9, it's actually speaking to them. You are a chosen race.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super interesting.
I thought there was something that made me think that there was a little bit of a mix, because it had mentioned something about like you used to live as the Gentiles did and like something
Yeah.
else. So that was where I was like, maybe it's mixed.
Yeah, that's where it gets confusing. Anyone else? Okay, I definitely agree with the Jewish statement. Oh, I need to be better at clicking here. Okay, so I definitely agree with that because, I mean, one thing he is calling them the chosen, and Israel was God's chosen nation. He refers to them as exiles, and we know from the Old Testament that the Jews have been exiled out of Jerusalem into Babylon, and kind of like he even uses the word like the Jews in a dispersion, and like the diaspora Jews are kind of like all the Jews that are living outside of Palestine, and so he's like really specifically like addressing almost like them, like to the exiles of the dispersion. Like that's a very like Jewish terminology. But then that's where it gets confusing, because when you start taking a closer look, you realize actually you come across verses that the letter wasn't just written to the Jews, but it was actually also addressed to Gentiles. And so, for example, we have in chapter 118, it says, knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers. I assume he's almost like addressing Gentiles here, because Peter is a Jew, and he would never probably consider his own forefathers like living that they lived in futile ways, because I mean, being a Jew is still a very like that's your identity, that's who you are. And then in chapter 4, verse 3, if you guys want to jump there with me, he is saying like, hey, for the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. And that's just not really the behavior of the Jews. Like, I feel like the biggest sin issue that we can observe from the Jewish people was legalism, like living way too close to the law, putting all up these boundaries and these fences that they would never step out of that. And I feel like we can see from other books, like the immorality is really like the Gentile issue, and he's specifically addressing the Gentile issue here again. And so views are kind of divided whether to take the word exiles of the dispersion at face value, or kind of like looking at it at a figurative term. And like, I was kind of like wondering, like, oh, does it actually matter if we make a clear distinction, if it's Jewish audience or Gentile audience? And kind of like looking at it almost like surface level, it doesn't really matter because they're believers. But I think if you want to take a deep dive into theology, it actually really does matter, because it comes into this whole topic, has the church replace the people of God? Have the church now replace basically the Jewish people? And that's a big verse that people who are standing on that side would take into consideration of like, okay, to make their statement. But I don't want to go into it. I don't know much about it, but I just thought I'm going to mention it just kind of like in order for like, you could go down that route and you will find probably views out there. But I want to keep it at a level of like, okay, we know they're believers. They're Jewish and Gentile background. Some resources say it's mostly Jewish. Some say it's mostly Gentile. We don't really know quite, but we know they are believers and they have received the gospel. So just kind of like letting you know what you probably will also come across in like the different resources that you are going to use. Yeah, and I also think since the audience is very mixed, he's speaking in a language that refers to both of them. And I feel like just that itself, knowing that Peter is in Rome, and from Romans we know they had this whole issue of disunity of Jewish and Gentile people, and the Jews were angry basically that the Gentiles took over. And he writes from Rome. And so I feel like it even like paints even like this beautiful picture of like unity, of like, hey, like Gentile, Jewish, we're all believers, we're all in this together. And yeah, it's just one body, it's one family. And the suffering that you're experiencing, you both are suffering, whether you're Jewish or you're Gentile, because you're suffering because you're a Christian and you're a believer. And I think even like looking at from that perspective that Peter wants to communicate, I think is really beautiful. as I said, I'm gonna send you guys this all out. Okay, now let's kind of like, yes.
I just can't stop thinking about how like Peter's in Rome because he like starts off in Jerusalem,
Yeah.
but like when he gets to Rome, did he like? Is there any insight on how he got there? Did he go through those regions and like know the people? Or
I can't tell you from the top of my head. I'm not sure if actually Acts maybe mentioned something if he ends up there. I think, as far as I know, I think it's church tradition that tells us that he ends up in Rome. Because we know like Mark was most likely written out of Rome on Peter's behalf, so it's to assume that they wrote it there together. Yeah. Maybe does anyone know about this? Yeah. Okay. But I can look it up and maybe I find something. Yeah. Okay. Let's finish our thoughts together. Let's bridge all these ideas of dating, audience, together with the dispersion and the exiles. Okay, so what is the reason written? Why did he wrote this book?
To help them endure their social persecution of the time. That's kind of what I.
Perfect. Yeah, no, that's great. That's exactly it. So yeah, encourage them in their persecution and how to respond in hardship. And then Peter's using the word exiles. He says them like, to those who are elect exiles after dispersion. And that is such a distinct term that it can only be found actually within Peter and in Hebrews. And I want you guys to open with me Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13. Just a couple chapters back. You guys already studied Hebrews, right? No, not yet? Nice. Well, I'm talking about chapter 11. It's the Hall of Faith. It's a good one. And would someone like to read verse 13 to 15?
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
All of these died in faith without having received the promises, but from a distance they saw and greeted them. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth. For people who speak in this way make it clear that they are seeking a holy land. If they had been thinking of the land that they had left behind, they would have had opportunity to return. What verse that was?
Just 15, that's great. In my translation, it actually says in verse 13, it says, and they were strangers and exiles on the earth. And so we know, like, chapter 11 is kind of like the Hall of Faith, all the great people who have, like, I guess, contributed something to the Bible, like they're kind of like mentioned in there. And the author of Hebrew, whoever that is using the word exile, or this term exiles, to refer to the Old Testament saints as strangers and exiles. And he's painting almost like these pictures of them living as strangers in a world that is actually not their home, among people who they do not belong, they're not a part of, and like kind of like visitors in this place for like just a temporary time. And I think when Peter's actually using the same word, he is probably like kind of like referring to the same idea as well. But he's addressing here the audience of the book and kind of like just telling them, hey, like you are God's people and you are temporary resident in this world. You're only strangers among people who do not belong. Like you are a Christian, but you do not belong into the world. You're not a part of the non-believers. And basically saying like to encourage them, like you're on your way home. Like there will come a time when Jesus will come back and he will take you into his heavenly city. But until then, you are a resident here. You're an exile here. You do not belong into this world, but you are living in this world. And I just feel like how much more meaningful does even the whole book become when he calls them right in the beginning, hey, like you're an exile. Like don't forget, like you don't live here. Or like you live here, but you do not belong into this world. Like there's something better to come. And like instantly, like like giving them perspective of like, hey, this is temporary, there's a future glory. Always think about this. There's something more to come. There's a glory to come. There's a heavenly home to go to. And I think it's just like the most encouraging thing when they're reading this, because it's like, hey, like, you're like, this is about to be like a very heavy message that I have to tell you, and I have to give you some like hard promises that there will be persecution, but just know from the beginning on, from the first sentence on, like, know that this is not your home and there's something better to come. Like, you actually, like, you are in exile. And that's just like this comfort thing that he wants to give them right away. And so all in all, summarized, who are the original readers is they are believers of Christ. They are followers of him, probably living they are living in Asia Minor around 64, and they're about to get a message of like, what does it look like to live life with a perspective of eternity. And Peter's kind of like unfolding this slowly and slowly throughout the letter. Does anyone have a question? Does this make sense? Kind of like with the whole like dispersion aspect and exile aspect? Great. All right. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I have to think of questions.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
With exile, so it could be like sort of like exile from this earth, and then another side could be like also exile from persecution, or was that like not? I don't know.
Well, we don't really have any evidence that the persecution and like led into exile or led into like what's it called, like that they're being exiled out of Rome. It was more like just like you're a Christian and you die, rather than like you're a Christian and you get exiled. So I'm not quite sure if, I think it's more like a figurative term. Yeah. Sweet. Yeah, if you think of any other questions, please let me know. Okay, let's do another quick break before we jump into the next session. Let's do like maybe like a 2 or 3 minute break, just like bathroom break, stretch.
What's up? Bro, I'm literally so bad at pizza. I can't even. I've tried my whole life. I can't even get it one time, but I can try. I mean, you don't have to. Okay, you start. I'll join you in a second. I want to look this up so that I'm like. No worries.
I probably needed to take something and put it in the fridge by now, though.
All right, let's continue.
Ah, we can get better. Yeah. Take it.
You don't want anybody messing up.
All right, how are you guys doing? Do the little stretch breaks help kind of get the brain juices flowing? Yeah. They implemented this on our base or like in our SBS like a few years ago. Before we had like 1 hour, 1.5 hour like sessions. And then now when we have a guest speaker, they do sometimes like a 1.5 hour sessions. You just notice like people are just like dozing off because people are so used to like now having like a break every 20 minutes. Yeah, I really appreciate it because it's sometimes hard for me to pay attention for like 1.5 hours at a time, especially if you're going to like some kind of like theology or like some deep doozies of books. So, but yeah, are you guys doing okay? What do you guys think about the book so far? Any questions? Or even thoughts? Like, I don't know, like how has maybe this already maybe changed the way you view the book? Do you feel like it's relatable of some sort?
I definitely feel like I know the author better,
Yeah,
and I think I'm wrapping my brain more around the recipient
yeah,
of it, and maybe even the climate of which they would have received the letter.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I wish I would have more information about like the exact setting they were in, but there's just not much. Yeah, but maybe like depending on the resource that you have, maybe as well, you find some as well. Yeah, I would love to know.
Just that piece about that area maybe hadn't been visited by the apostles.
Yeah,
That helps a lot with
yeah,
this understanding. This one's at
yeah.
least for me.
Mhm.
I just find that there's a lot of like one-liners in this that I've like recognized. I'm just curious on what like how that fits in the whole context of the book.
Yeah. Do you have an example?
Just like the ones where it's like pious, I think pious scars definitely healed is in this one.
Where is that?
What is it? And there's that verse where it says by his wounds you've been.
Yeah, it sounds familiar. I just don't. Yeah.
First Peter 2:20. Yeah, so it's in here somewhere.
220.
2:24. Maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's.
I looked it up, but then I was like, well, maybe that translation's different.
No, that's a good question. And I think actually this session will help you because we're looking now at, okay, what is the message of the book? What is the structure of it? And I feel like then even with understanding that, you can, like even like whatever book you're studying, if you look at a passage that just doesn't make any sense, like what is he talking about? Looking at it in the context of the main message of the book at like a top level, but then also if you boil it down to like, okay, what then does the structure say about it? And in what section or segments or division of the book does it lay in? I think that already gives you then like this second like step into like, okay, what could it fit in? Like there's always like with every book, like there's the structure and then the author has like his like very way of like how he composed it. And I think it's fascinating to like really kind of like dig into like, okay, what is the way he like coordinated like these like obviously they didn't have verses, but he had a way he placed the sentences in this book, and so kind of like because he wanted to paint a picture, and so I feel like it's interesting in looking at that as well. And I hope this actually will help you a little bit now as well, because it really helped me kind of like breaking it up into like pieces. Like, okay, why does he say these things in this context? Who already, like you guys have already done it out loud, right? Has anyone done like the structure, the PTs?
No structure yet.
Okay, but like paragraph titles, great. What would you say, having done the out loud, what would you say is kind of like, what are the main themes within this book? We kind of like already touched on this, but I want to. Suffering, yeah. Sanctification, always a good one. Humility, yep. There's one more that I'm actually looking for. Then we covered them all. Salvation, yes. That's not one of them, but it is talked about. Yeah. All right. So one big one is sanctification, and you're welcome for a structure here. Yeah, better put your. There's different ways to do it, but this is kind of like a very common one. You probably come across this one, but use different titles. Don't. I have very basic titles, so. I expect to see very creative titles this afternoon. With a student, every book that she studied her book title was somehow related to Star Wars. She loved Star Wars, so somehow she always had like a pun in there or something. Yeah. Submission, that's one. That's a big part of in here. Then suffering and humility. So, it was nice while it lasted. Don't worry, we'll get back to it. So, we already talked about the reason written. What is the main idea of the book? Looking in the context of like the topics used. No. Like humility, suffering, I even forgot them. Sanctification. We'll get back to them. It's too much clicking. But yeah, looking at the like kind of like these topics of the book, knowing that it is written to encourage a Christian within their persecution how to deal with suffering. What do you think is the main idea that he's trying to communicate with the things that he put in there?
Christ-likeness, holiness.
Yeah.
Say like suffering will come as a way to.
Yeah.
That suffering is almost like a way to lead that brings you to humility if you'll allow it. Like it's
Yeah.
like a refining.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah.
Suffering for Christ's sake.
Yeah. You guys are amazing.
Humbly suffer so that it leads to sanctification.
That's a great sentence. Amazing. that's awesome.
That they have a new identity that calls them to suffering.
Yeah. Yeah. Guys, they're amazing. You guys are amazing. Yeah, so Christians are called to endure suffering for the sake of Christ, looking back on Christ's sufferings and forward to the consummation of salvation in his second coming. I did not write this sentence, and so I boiled it down in a little bit more simple language. Christians are suffering like Jesus had suffered in hope and anticipation of Jesus' second coming and the promised glory. I feel like that sums up really well, kind of like just like all the things that he's touching on and why he is touching on that as well. So keep that main idea in mind as well. But as well, you'll come up with your own main idea in your own fancy sentence. So, okay. And when we look at that, it's interesting how Peter then actually wrote it, because in some sort, he wrote it in a cyclical way. Not that he is using cycles throughout, but in a way that he moves through this letter and he continuously touches back on suffering. He always returns back to Christ's suffering and his resurrection to kind of like bring everything that he's touching on into the light of that, because it is so important to understand his suffering and his resurrection. And so you will notice that it is this pattern that he wants them to start like realizing, because his suffering is what eventually saved them all, and his resurrection is the thing that gives them hope. And so throughout, he always wants to touch back on that, and you will see it like it's always mentioned like suffering, hope, like you will see this interchange of words. And so when you come across, like when he mentions Christ's suffering, you will see probably in the next sentence, he's actually using of some sort the word hope in it as well. So that's kind of like the thing that he really always wants to touch base on. And again, it is really just to give the audience perspective of what they're going through and what they're in. Because so because again, like looking at Peter's life, like at some point in life, that's when he realized to the core that he was chosen, that he's a part of the royal priesthood, that he is this new holy temple, that he literally embodies that. And that's the thing that carries him through life. And that's exactly what he wants the readers to realize as well. Because Peter, like, it took him a little while probably to realize that and to see that. And so that's why he's touching on so many of those, like, very foundational identity things within this book. Because that's the thing that eventually that saved him and that gives him hope. And he wants the readers to understand what saved them, what gives them hope, and in order to walk out in their identity of all of these things. I want to briefly look at each section that I mentioned, and then in the next session, I want to talk about suffering in specific. But before I want to jump into that, I just want to give you guys a quick overview of like the topics like sanctification and how do they actually fit into the book. Because some are kind of like, okay, I didn't first understand, okay, what does this actually have to do with that? But I hope of some sort, this will make sense at the end of this. All right. Okay, first off, why do you think Peter would spend so much time, like 1.5 chapters on sanctification? Looking at looking what the book is about. Yeah. Great. Anything else? Yes. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yes.
I mean, the more I read it and the more I consider Whitney's insight, I feel like maybe it really was a Gentile reader. Because in chapter 2, he talks about being chosen, but then he talks about how they put one spar off
Yeah.
for him. And so maybe reiterating the lifestyle of
Yes.
Christ-likeness to those that were used to a pagan approach to it.
Yeah, amazing. Great thinking. Honestly, I'm like, you guys have great answers. So I'm just kind of like up here summarizing what you guys are saying. But I feel like you guys have already such a good grasp on that and I feel like you guys have a clear way of thinking and to observe and interpret what these authors are trying to say. So good on ya. You guys have good leaders probably to teach you. All right, so why is he touching on that? And so he probably heard of like some reports that have come in that like Christians do live actually like Gentiles, and that's why he's specifically addressing that as well. Again, and I mean they didn't have like a written New Testament or written books really to live by. I mean, if there was a letter that was a circular thing, probably they didn't have like their own copy most likely. And so I think we saw this throughout the whole New Testament, like issues of immorality are quite common within the New Testament, and that's something they often struggle with. And so what is the connection of sanctification and the suffering? And I think it is to put like you said, like to put an eternal perspective on it. And to put the current circumstances that they're living in into the perspective of eventually spending eternity with Christ without suffering. But here's the thing, and that kind of like, I'm not sure, like I was kind of like just wrestling with, because, and I know there's probably people out there who are wrestling with that question. And because if you are actually so focused on eternity and you know that you're sealed into eternity, what's the point of doing right then when you have it anyways? If that makes sense? So why do you have to focus so much on doing good in the present age when you actually have eternity saved anyways for yourself? And so Peter really he wants to focus on that. And so because he says, or he wants them to know that their new identity, them being saved, should be their motivation to do good. And so they're called to be holy, they're called to be different, and they're called to not live as Gentiles or Jews, but actually as God's people within this world. And so that's why he's touching on so many things. Like, for example, the whole verse 3 is, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, unfading, kept in heaven for you, who by God's power, being guarded through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time." But then also in verse 13, he says, "Therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ." So there's so many things that he's talking about, like their identity that they have in Christ, and like their sanctification they should be living in. And even like with 13, it says like, "Prepare your minds for action and be sober-minded." And just like the sanctification, them being holy, like it all starts in their mind. It is a thinking process, and that's kind of like the very foundation of it. And I think that's something that is just very important for them to understand when they look at that. And you will notice this as you're charting, like there's so much that he talks about sanctification and such a depth to it that it's just like interesting to think about when you put it into the perspective of like suffering, eternal perspective, encouragement, and comfort. And so, yeah, like always, when you go through the sections, think back on the main idea and the reason written in order to put it into the big picture of the whole book. Okay, submission. Why is this part in here? What do you think? Sorry?
They're not living the way they relate in their relationships does not reflect the kingdom of God.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else?
I feel like it's a really powerful way to reflect Christ and how he was submitted to the Father. It's trusting God
Mm-hmm.
and submitting to what God's asked them to do as believers.
Yeah. Yeah. I think simply put, it's just really he's showing like how to function together as God's people in this world, even though maybe you don't agree. Like say like you don't agree with the person, or he talks about slaves, and slave riots at that time was one of the biggest uproars that the Romans had to deal with. And so really kind of like to put that into perspective of like, okay, actually living together as God's people is a very strong way of like showing who you belong to. I wanted to spend actually much more time on this topic because I feel like submission to authority and submission to government is a huge topic, a hot topic these days, but I just felt like that's just not what to focus on, and it is such a heated topic. But I feel like thinking about what Peter has to say in here, and really boil it back to like who is in control. Like think about that. Like, and he's reminding them like God is in control. He has put everything into place. And there's this quote from Robert Cook that I really like, and he says, "We are to submit to the authority of government rulers by obeying them. We should do this not because these individuals are personally worthy of our submission necessarily, but for the Lord's sake, because by submitting to them, we honor God by obeying his word." Peter reminded his readers that government has a valid and necessary God-appointed purpose: the punishment of evildoers, of the praise of those who do right. the presence of political corruption should not blind us to the legitimate role of the government that God has ordained. And I think that puts it really well of like, yeah, I mean, they might be really bad people, but at the end of the day, we can trust that they are somehow, that God has his hand in it. And that's something sometimes really hard to realize. And I feel like, I mean, we're here in America, but like looking at other nations where there's insane suppression. Like I have so many questions, like how is North Korea a part of God's plan? Like this, like the rulers there, like how does this fit in? So I don't even want to open this kind of worms, but I think this quote actually helped me a lot to kind of like put that into perspective of like boil it down to like God is in control, and God is in control in every aspect of your household. Yeah. All right. So then so there's this topic of suffering in between, but I want to touch on humility first. And so Peter's finishing up the whole book with the theme of humility, and really just like to almost summarizing it all, it's about mutual submission, honoring and loving each other. And that is super important within the context of that. And so when you look at that as well, when you get through to that part, like keep that in mind. And now with the suffering part, suffering is a huge topic, and it's often not a topic that people like to talk about because it's a really hard topic. We all have experienced our own fair share probably of suffering. Maybe you are at a point where you say like, actually, I'm really blessed, like I haven't experienced it. Maybe you have recently walked through something, or you know someone who has walked through something. And so I know everyone has their own story and everyone has their own experience. And I feel like often, I heard this question a lot, and I have this question still, how can a good God allow suffering? Like, why does it happen? It's kind of like the first thing when you maybe even like bring up suffering to maybe non-believers, of them saying like, why would, if your God is so good and so loving, why do people suffer? And it's like, yeah, that's a great question. And so, like, so many people deal differently with suffering, and I heard many people going in different directions. So Christians who are maybe coming, when they walk through intense suffering, coming to a conclusion of like, actually God doesn't care, or of like, yeah, God is apathetic, he is cruel, or he doesn't exist. And then people go different directions with that as well, to either like they're losing their faith, to twisting their faith, or maybe their faith is actually strengthened. So you hear everything, and you can see and observe all the directions that people are going. And so Peter, he had experience, like where the point that Peter is taking is from his own experience, and as he said, as a witness of the sufferings of Christ. And so now, keeping in mind that he's trying to prepare his readers to experience suffering, and since the book is also in some way written for us to get something from it and to get truth from it, it's really also for us to prepare us for suffering and how to walk through it rightly. It is very confronting. It is a topic that is hard to deal with, but is at the same time very comforting if you put it into the right perspective. And the right perspective is that glory is literally around the corner from where we're at. Like, we maybe now have like this, like that, we see life as like this, like really like 70, 80, 90 year long process. But if you actually would zoom out, and the way God is probably looking at it, we're literally a spark in existence of time, like in eternity. Like, there's so much more to come. This sucks at times. It really does. But there's something way better to come. There's glory right around the corner. There's a new heaven and a new earth right around the corner where everything is going to be reconciled. And that's really where we have to come around to understand when we go through that. But yeah, I'm not here to give any solutions, to give any final answers, but maybe of some sort of a framework of how to deal with it and how to look at it, and maybe how we can comfort each other. If you ever come across like someone who has dealt with this, how you can, like, I don't know, talk about it, ask questions, but at the end of the day, we're not the ones, like we can't fix it. Suffering exists in this world, and the only thing that we can always just look forward to is the returning of Jesus Christ, because that's when everything is going to be restored. And so I think in conclusion of this overview of what this book is about, I feel like the term exile is just like summarizing it so well, because it's really just like it's temporary. We don't belong into this world. We are like set up. We are supposed to be set apart and holy, living a life according to the kingdom, because the actual kingdom, like God's kingdom, with Jesus returning to his throne in this world, like that's about to come. And I think that's just, puts it really well of just like knowing like, hey, you are all exiles. The original readers were exiles. There's something to come when we actually return to our heavenly home, to our actual home that we belong to. Because this is not it, even though sometimes we make it that. But yeah. And so that's what Peter's going for. That's the perspective that Peter is going for. Yeah, let's have another quick break. Digest that for a moment. Because in the next session, I want to talk about how Peter's specifically talking about suffering. And yeah, I'm excited about it because he has some really, really good things to say. All right, let's continue. The baby's probably everyone's favorite in here. Yeah, fair enough. Okay, is it okay if I start or should I? Okay, great. Yeah, I just want to, there's some more to cover and I really don't want to go too much longer. Okay. First, I want to talk about why there is even suffering. Just give a general idea of like why is there suffering in this world, why we experience it as Christians. And then I want to look at some points that Peter is specifically making within the book of like how can we actually deal with the suffering that is being experienced. And he gives us some like cool points and some sort of a framework of how to deal with it. Okay, the first thing is like it's all started in Genesis. We're living in a fallen world. Genesis 3, Adam and Eve ate the fruit, and the curse was placed over the world, over earth, and suffering entered the world. And so that's why we're all born into a world where there is disease, where there's cancer, where there is mass shootings, where there's really horrible sin, nature catastrophes, all things that are 100% out of our control. And there's this verse in Romans, it's chapter 8, 18 to 25. I'm just going to read it. It says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with an eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected to it in hope, that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now, and not only the creation, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we are saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope for what he sees. But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience." And so, yeah, like he's saying, like, yeah, creation was subject to futility. There is groaning in pain, waiting eagerly for the redemption. So until then, we are suffering. And until Jesus is coming back, yeah, that's just what life, unfortunately, is going to be like. And then the second point is there's suffering in this world for specific sin that has been committed. Romans 6:22 talks about for the wages of sin is death. And yeah, when you make poor choices, you bring the consequences of that upon you as well. And then the third one is why we're suffering. A reason could be that is a discipline from God. And so point 3 and 4 actually specifically apply to Christians, whereas point 1 and 2 apply to non-Christians as well. Like they're also born into a world of sin and into a fallen world, and where they also suffer under their consequences. But the other two reasons, 3 and 4, are specifically for Christians. And so one of them is sometimes hard things happen because of part of God's discipline. And we have two examples like this in the New Testament. One of them is in Acts 5. It's the story of Ananias and Sapphira who are lying and saying like they have given money, but they actually haven't. And they're being struck down immediately. And then the other one is in Corinthians, where Paul is saying, like, actually, you are suffering because of your sin that you have committed within the Lord's Supper, because you have not dealt with it righteously. And so he gives them, like, actually, like, the example of, like, why they're suffering. And it's important to remember that consequences, like God's consequences, always happen for the goal of redemption and sanctification. That's like when you're raising a child and something like you have to give consequences, you tell the kid why why you're doing it, in order for him not doing it again. And that same thing is with God as well. Like, you see these passages where basically it says like, yeah, and then he handed them over to Satan. And that's not just like, yeah, I'm done with you forever. It's like, no, with the goal for them to realize life outside of the kingdom is actually not fun. It's actually very tragic for them then to come back, because they have tasted what life with God looks like. And so, yeah. And then the final reason is actually found within Peter. And unfortunately, there is Christian suffering for doing actually what is the right thing. There's in this fallen world, yeah, Christians suffer for doing what is the right thing, and that's a spiritual persecution, and that's kind of like what the original readers are facing within this. And it's kind of like hard to deal with, because there's like this like whole mindset of like, well, I'm doing everything right. I feel like I'm like following God. I worship him, but still these bad things happen. And so like that's kind of like this a pagan mindset almost, because like how like Gentiles in the Old Testament, or like they used to go to the temple to like bring their alms, bring their money, bring their worship in order then for them to receive. But unfortunately, this is not how our relationship with Christ works. Like, there's nothing we can do to please God. And unfortunately, there's still the suffering that happens because we're doing right. And that's mostly then maybe in form even of like a social persecution, if that makes sense. But yeah, at the end, like Peter is really giving us like the ultimate example of like who suffered for doing what is right, and that is Jesus. And that's the verse in chapter 2, verse 21 to 25. And that's, if you look at this verse, when you go through it, that's kind of like the center of the book, and everything radiates around it, and everything points to it, and everything shines from it. And it says, "For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed, for you were straying like sheep, but you now return to the shepherd and overseer of your souls." And so really consider this as like almost like the center of the book, where everything just radiates from it, because that's the example he wants them to, the example and the perspective he wants them to have.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
So number 2, can you explain again how you're differentiating suffering for specific sins from the suffering of the law?
Yeah, well, I kind of like look at it from just a perspective of Christians, the latter two, of just like there is the sin that is happening to Christians because of like the direct consequence of what they have done, if that makes sense.
Okay.
But it is kind of like going alongside suffering for specific sins. I do agree with that. I just wanted to kind of like break it down even like of like it also happens in New Testament times almost, if that makes sense. I kind of like wanted to point that out specifically, because that's often maybe also people are stuck on of like, wait, what about Ananias and Sapphira? Like, why would God do something like this? Or like when he actually says like, you are suffering, or you are dealing with like sickness because of your sin in the Lord's Supper. Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that out. So yeah, kind of like with all of that, why suffering? Like, is there a recipe to it? No, there isn't. There really isn't a solution. There's not a right way to do it. There's not a right answer to give to someone. What we know is God hates suffering. Like, he absolutely abhors it. He doesn't want us to go through it. And he has a way out, and that's with him coming back. But with that, he is really patient, and we have to be really patient. I believe probably a lot of the New Testament authors thought Jesus will come back within their time. And here we are 2,000 years later, we're still waiting for this. And actually, 2 Peter gives us an answer about this. Because in 2 Peter 3:9, I have bless you. It says, the Lord is not slow to fulfill his promises, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing that any would perish, but that all should reach repentance. And so we're waiting for a long time until like there's the perfect amount of numbers saved until he's coming back. And that's kind of like his way out of the suffering, out of the tragedy that is happening within this world. All right. Does anyone have a question? Thoughts? All right, now I want to specifically look at Peter. And yeah, just kind of like how he explains like how can we deal with this suffering. And he gives us some really like specific steps. The first one is that I want to talk about is eternal perspective. And I already talked a lot about it, but I want to point out where Peter is specifically talking about it. And so in the verses 1:7, 4:14, and 5:10, and I just kind of like briefly look over them. So in verse 7 is, or kind of like starting right before, if necessary, you have been grieved with various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So that's what I mentioned before, where he talks about the various trials, but then the glory that is coming with it. And he does actually the same thing if you look at verse 4:14 and 5:10 as well, where he talks about the trials, but then at the glory that comes and that they should have with their perspective. Yeah, and I mentioned that as well, but it's just like our lives here are like such a small moment within this time compared to what is to come. And Peter really has like this perspective of eternity ingrained in his mind. And he knows like that one day Jesus will come back, and that's how he endures, and that's how he wants the authors to endure, the original readers to endure. And I read an article about suffering by John Piper, and the article basically starts with the question of like, why would anyone become a Christian if what you could offer them was that things in this world would most likely get worse for them and that their lives would be at risk? And his answer to this was, the answer is that the greatest human needs are not to live long on the earth and be comfortable. The biggest human needs are how to have our sins forgiven and overcome our separation from God and live forever with happiness in his presence instead of living forever in misery and hell. That's 10,000 times more important than living long on the earth and being comfortable for a zillionth percentage of your existence. And when I think about eternal perspective, I think about my mother-in-law, because I mentioned that we got married last September and we actually moved here. We were planning on spending our first year still doing missions in Australia, working with SBS. But then suddenly in August, we got a call that my wife's mother, her name is Melissa, she was really sick. And she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, which and they gave her like a life perspective of like 1 to 2 years. And so we came home immediately. We got married a week later. We left, moved to Colorado to spend time with her family, or with her mom. And it's really interesting because her mom, like she was a believer, and the moment she got diagnosed, she had the greatest perspective. She never complained about her sickness. She never asked God, like she probably asked God questions, but she didn't complain about like, why does she have to go through this suffering? Because she could have all these reasons. Like I had a great life. She worked in radiology for 36 years as a nurse, so she helped so many people with cancer. And yet she was the one who had it, and so she could have had so many questions about it. And so she had such a great perspective. And the thing is that like hope of eternity and hope of the glory to come really like became so real to her the moment she got her diagnosis, because it's the thing she had to cling on to, because it was the only thing that could give her hope. Yeah, it was the only thing that gave her hope and could give her strength. Sorry. Thinking about the time she passed away on March 13th, it actually like really seems like this surreal moment, because when we got like we expected it that it will happen. And the moment we got the call, I just like, my wife and I both just had like this like feeling like, wow, like she literally just took her last breath. But at the same time, she took her first breath with Jesus at her side. Like for her, life just started. Life just became really great, really awesome, because now actually eternity, where she's living life to the fullest, she's fully restored, there's no more suffering, and she actually get to experience that already. And it made me like realize like, wow, like I want that so much. And having her almost like live that and being an example for that to us was like, gave us like, actually like it really was the thing that carried us through it, because knowing that she's now with Christ, that she is good forever and that we will see her again, that there will be a reunion, like that's literally like the example of like what eternal perspective looks like. And yeah, and so the assurance and the comfort to know that this suffering is so temporary is like, yeah, what carried us through. And not to say like, obviously it's been really tough and there's a lot of grief to deal with, and especially for my wife as well, like her mom was her best friend, and not having her by her side anymore to ask questions about life and whatever is like been really tough. And but I can say like, I don't know, like yeah, it's just been good having of some sort this assurance of like that there will be something like, and that God has been there with it. And my wife, like, has her own story to tell with that as well, obviously, and it's been really challenging for her as well. And everyone's grief has different time, has a different timeline. Some things come up later, some things come up sooner, and there's more things to come. But yeah, I don't know, that's just kind of like the story that I affiliate with eternal perspective, and just kind of like what we've all walked through. And I hope of some sort that this can encourage you as well, either in your own life or someone that you can encourage of like, hey, there is so much more to come, and it is so temporary here in this life that we're living. Then the next example is kind of that Peter's giving is to orientate yourself in Jesus' example of his suffering. And that's mentioned in chapter 2:21, kind of like 3:18 and 4:11, where, like I already talked about 2:21, kind of I guess the center of the book. But I feel like he almost like, when he like wrote these things, like he recites kind of like what Jesus has been telling him. Like for example, like the story in the upper room of like where Jesus is telling them, hey, like if they hate you, if they hate the disciples, just know that they hated me first. And if they persecute you, just remember that they persecuted me first. And that's kind of like the same thing that he's touching on as well. We are supposed to follow in his footprints or footsteps of suffering. And there's a few verses that I want to show you that are kind of like touching on the same thing. It's in Philippians and Hebrews and Mark. In Philippians, where Paul is saying like, oh, that I might know him and the fellowship of his sufferings. And in Hebrews, he says, he suffered outside the gate, hence let us go with him outside the camp bearing his reproach. And then in Mark, Jesus is saying, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. And of some sort, there's just like, I take encouragement within the fact to know, like, it is to be expected because Jesus has suffered. And if we want to really truly follow his steps, like some sort of suffering will come. Unfortunately, some experience different kinds of sufferings. But yeah. And then the next thing is to respond in the opposite spirit of what. So basically, like, not to fight back and not to seek revenge. Both of these things that I already mentioned, like Peter experienced firsthand because he was the impulse, harsh guy who was rebuking Jesus and was cutting off the servant's ear. But actually, like, what he now writes is like, actually, do not revile them if they revile you. Like, do not be that person who's fighting back. Sorry, I'm kind of like browsing through these, but you will have so much time on your own time as well to like kind of go into these. The next one is do not fear. In 3:14 and 3:16, he says, do not fear and do not be troubled. Why? Because you have the eternal perspective. And in Acts, we see Peter was arrested and he was in prison and he was probably supposed to be like probably martyred for what he has done, but then he kind of like got freed. But then you also have the same story of other people in Acts of like actually don't have the same story. So some apostles or like some preacher like Stephen, like he got stoned at the end. And so some experience different kinds, but at the end, like he has the encouragement of like, do not fear because you're like, yeah, because it like basically like, yeah, eternally you are saved and you are sealed in eternity. And they maybe can hurt your body, but your salvation is something that is like out of body, that is like, has nothing to do with your physical existence. And then keep a clear conscience is the next one. You guys just raise the hand if you have a question, okay? Here with that, it's not so much about defending yourself, but more about defending the gospel. And so knowing, okay, when you are actually suffering because you have done right, like actually this can become a really great opportunity to share the gospel, because I feel like if they would actually see what you have done, this like is such a big testimony. But that's why he says like actually have a clear conscience, and at some point he mentioned like actually prepare your minds for action and be sober-minded. I think with that as well, because actually if you have done something that you're not supposed to do, and like you're almost like the hypocrite then, if that makes sense, because if you have no reason to say like, well, actually like I have done right, but no, because you haven't, if that makes sense. That's kind of like where he's going here. And then the last one is to expect hardship. And he mentioned this in 4:12, and he says specifically, beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you, not to test you as though something strange were happening to you. And yeah, just like obviously expect it. Don't be pessimistic, but be realistic that this is a part of life. And of some sort, I wonder if this is actually can help as a coping mechanism of like knowing that stuff like this is happening and it is not out of nowhere, basically. But yeah, I remember the quote that I was saying, like, why would people want to receive the gospel if you cannot promise them that life would actually get better? And like even think about this in the aspect of like, what does sharing the gospel with people look like? Because say like if you're in a lot of countries, like even now still, sharing the gospel with people most likely can get them in trouble. Like if you share the gospel with someone in China or in North Korea or in Iran, like there's a pretty good assurance if they at some point would testify that they will get in trouble. And so I feel like for us as Westerners in this world, like we're almost like a little isolated from this kind of aspect. But looking at suffering in other worlds where you're a Christian, it is so different. Like for them, it's almost like having the assurance of like, no suffering is going to happen. There's this author, and he wrote a book. It's called The History of Christian Mission. His name is Stephen Neal. And he said that for the first 3 centuries, when the church was spreading like a wildfire, every new Christian knew that at some point in their life, they had to testify their faith for the sake of their life. And so just like, yeah, like imagine like what actually that looks like what that would have looked like for them of like, hey, like, yeah, you will receive this, but there's a consequence to it. Do you still want to do it? Like the yes is so harder, I feel like. And then, yeah, the last one is just the assurance that Peter is giving them, like, hey, actually, you're not alone. It's in 5 verse 9. He tells them, resist him, firm in your brotherhood. Resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. And yeah, just to tell them, like, you're not alone in this, because suffering, if you've experienced it, like, it can feel really isolating because you feel like actually no one can relate to what you're going through. No one has experienced what you're going through. But actually knowing like, hey, there's other people who are going through the same thing. This is not just coming upon you. And yeah, I've just like he doesn't just say like, hey, know that there's like people within like Cappadocia or Bithynia. No, he actually tells them like, there's people around the world who are suffering as well. And so take like faith in that as well. And I don't know, of some sort of encouragement. And yeah, kind of like all of these things. Again, what I'm saying, like there's not an easy answer to suffering, but I think it has to do with perspective. It has to come to an understanding of like, where's our salvation? Where are we sealed in? And knowing that Jesus is with us and he wants us that in those situations that we entrust ourselves to him. And that was right as I was writing these things. So I actually taught these books back last November to another SBS, and I feel like now writing my notes again and studying it again, I actually came then to question when I was looking at these 7 steps of like, do I actually believe these things? Like, are these the steps that helped me through the last season? And I must say, like, it wasn't always easy. Like, I feel like all of this has not always come easy to me, and I feel like that's okay. But I had some weird assurance that I just knew that God is there, that he's doing something. And even within the darkest days, we were just like knowing at the end, coming back to the conclusion of like, we know she's good now. And even our life here, we are like, have no idea what life is going to be like because it looked different for the past 6 years. But just like of some sort, like we just entrust ourselves to God. And I feel like that's my biggest encouragement as well. If you are ever going through something like this, like God is most likely not going to give you the answers when you want the answers. We want answers so instantaneous, but he doesn't work like that. But at the same time, he will reveal glimpses of his plan at his given time. That is often slower than we would like it, but I for sure now, like when I taught it in November and to now, like I have such a different perspective of our situation. Like it was so tough leaving Australia after 6 years being there and doing YWAM and doing SBS. Like that's what I lived for. I was so passionate about it. I loved it. And then within a month, we left everything and I came to America and I was like, what is this place? Like I just didn't feel home. I didn't have anything to do. Like I had no passion. I was just kind of like floating by each day. And back when I taught it then, I told them like, I have no idea what life is about. I still have so many questions. And now it's like cool, like 7 months later, like there were so many good things that happened to us in the last 7 months. God has has done something in so many great ways, but that has taken 7 months, and I'm excited to think about what is the next 7 months going to look like. What is the perspective for that? What is the next 5 years, 10 years going to be? Because I feel like if you just entrust yourself to God and know at the end of the day, like, He wants the best for you, I feel like something good is going to happen. Or even if maybe something good doesn't happen the way you expected it to be, He will turn it into something good. And that's just, I think, the encouragement that I can really take from this book, and from knowing of like, hey, there's a good at the end of the tunnel, and there's the darkness is there and is in this world, but also Jesus has brought light in, and He wants us to be in this light. But this process of getting into that looks different for everyone, if that makes sense. All right. So that's kind of like it for this whole session on like suffering. And I know I'm a bit out of time, but I probably will have maybe another 10, 15 minutes just to talk about this really complicated passage in chapter 4. I think that will help you a lot with the charting as well. And I'm here this afternoon if you guys need any help as well or have any questions about it. All right, I'm just going to jump in without a break, even though we all love the breaks. Before, though, do you guys have any thoughts? I know this was a lot. This is heavy stuff to go through. But yeah, if you guys have any thoughts, any questions, maybe something that stood out to you. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
In your points of like how to suffer, what does it look like to respond in the opposite spirit?
That's a good question.
And it's something you have to think about.
Yeah. Well,
I'm always just left with like, but how does it look? You know, we're told what and why to live it, and I always am left with.
yeah. I feel like when I think about it, I think it really depends on what the situation is. Say in our example, like with Kaylee and I, when I'm thinking about how we try to respond in the opposite spirit, because I feel like when you when you just walk through something like this, there's sometimes days that are just like continuously so dark, and it's just very like, it's sad, and it's okay to be, that's all like very fair. But then also like, I know for us, maybe responding in the opposite spirit is actually looking at the hope. Like, yeah, there was death, but what is the hope out of it? Like, I feel like that helped us a lot, reminding us of that. I feel like spending life with people and doing life with people was for us in some way responding in the opposite spirit. Yeah, but I guess there's there's so many aspects of like what suffering could be like, if that makes sense. Yeah, Deanna, you have a...
It's so minute, but me and my husband were talking about something like this, and I wanted to look at the scripture that you referenced to see it was along the same line. I think so, even though it's far from being abused. But we just came from out of town. We have these two suitcases, and one suitcase, the zipper don't hardly work, and the other one, it works just fine. And so my husband was like, I am not using the one with the broken zipper, right? So it's smaller,
And that's such a good point, because that also what's also the point that Peter is making. He's like, yeah, we respond in the opposite spirit, but also on top of that, turn the other cheek, go the extra mile. And that's what Jesus was talking about as well. And I feel like that's kind of like, makes me think of that. And that's super challenging, because it's like doing all these things. I'm like, Jesus had he did so much, and he was just like, yeah, take my life, take my body. Thanks for that input. Kind of like the last thing that I want to talk about now is this really random passage about Christ, Noah, and the baptisms of Christ preaching to the dead people in Hades. This part about Noah and baptism, it's so much things put together of where is he going with this? And so, where's the prison? Who are the spirits? Does baptism save you? Once you have, you mentioned, once you have suffered, you don't sin anymore. Who's the dead who's being preached to, and so on. And to really kind of catch the essence of what is being said here, we got to look at the verses that come before that and what come after. And I put it up here, but also I want you guys to open it up in your Bible. Open up chapter 3, verse 17. I just want to go through this together with you guys through the text. And again, I don't have the final answers to this. There's still a lot of questions that I have, but I'm trying to help you guys kind of how do you tackle something that is super, super confusing. Okay, so to catch what is being said here, let's look at verse 17 and 18. So, it says in 17, "For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. For Christ has also suffered once for the sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirits. And then comes all the confusing bits. In which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience, through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, with angel authorities, powers having been subjected to him." And so we can assume that all the verses from after 18, basically, Peter is giving us some kind of reason or some encouragement for why suffering is happening in this world. And so let's go a bit further down. If you look at 22, at this point, there was no paragraphs. There was no really any verses. It says, "Since therefore Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourself with the same way of thinking." So he brings it back to verse 17 with this the connection piece. So therefore, arm yourself. And so when you see stuff like this, or in verse 17 starts with, "For it is better to suffer," and then 18, "For Christ also suffered." He always connects ideas with that. So again, what I was saying with verse 22, "Since therefore Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourself with the same way of thinking." With that, he's bringing it back to verse 17. The mindset of Christianity, the mindset of this epistle is, so whatever is saying here in verse 18 to 22, what is said about Noah, Jesus preaching to the dead, is somewhat intended by Peter to bring encouragement to them. Christians suffer for being Christians, and suffering of very kind is our portion when we do wrong or when we do right. That's just a part of it. And so, with every verse that is in this, maybe ask yourself the question, how does this get this ready for this kind of life? How does this get them ready for suffering? How is this supposed to encourage them in suffering? And that's where we have to then go back to the original context and of the setting as well. Like, that is really hard for us to understand. We're so removed from the culture, from what they have gone through, from the tension that is arising. But a few points that Peter is making here are the following verses. So, for example, in verse 18, he says, For Christ also suffered once for the sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God. And so Christ has died for our sins, and he has brought us to God. So Christ is the one who has saved us. So that's one encouraging thing we can take from that. But then, who actually is all of that as well, again? And so, think about the story of Noah, and that's the story of, he brings in here now the story of Noah, and that is somehow, he's connecting Noah to the us in verse 18. Bring us to God. That's, yeah, if that makes sense. So Genesis chapter 6, there was an evil world, and God is punishing them all with the flood, and Noah builds the ark. No one believes Noah, and everyone is reviling and opposing Noah for what he has done. And then basically the story of Noah is just showing this picture of a righteous man doing what God tells him to do in an unrighteous world where no one believes him and everyone opposes him. And so just like the original reader, being the righteous one living in an unrighteous Roman Empire, the original reader are being verbally abused, reviled, opposed, rejected. Just don't fit in, really struggling. And so Peter is telling the original reader as well that they will have their share in eternal glory like Noah did as well, because it's the same picture. Like Noah in his days, like the water was the one who saved him, and then he brings in the picture here with the baptism is the thing that brings new life. And it's not saying like baptism saves you, but it's this picture of washing away the old and bringing in the new. John Piper has this quote. It says, "Baptism is an outward expression of faith, inward appeal to God for cleansing. In other words, baptism is a way of saying to God, I trust you to apply the death of Jesus to me for my sins and to bring me through the death and the judgment into a new and everlasting life through the resurrection of Jesus." And it's really easy to get stuck on these verses, to like really get hung up on it. But I think what's really important is to understand, and I think what the author intended to do is to think about how God is bringing new life through water and how he saves eventually. And I don't think Peter tried to get us too hung up on these verses about the dead and the spirits. I think we really we kind of have to zoom out of here and say, okay, what is the main idea of the book? What is the main idea of like being saved through the death of Jesus Christ? And that's how we can endure suffering, because there's glory to come. And the main idea of the book is endure suffering. So there's some kind of encouragement to find in these verses. And so maybe like boil it back to that, zoom out rather than getting stuck within the details. And so I really hope that helped you of some sort, getting a little bit of a framework. I still have so many questions about this passage. I think it's a very complicated passage. I was talking to Ron and Judy Smith, and their answers were they just also have a lot of questions about it, and same with a lot of other people who have been for years in SBS. And so that's kind of the approach that I'm taking when I really am stuck on something that I cannot understand, of okay, is this a hill to die on? It's really not. How can we still make sense of something instead of just skipping it, zoom out, put it into the context, and how can you look at this passage of how should it bring encouragement? How should it fit into the main idea, if that makes sense? But yeah, if you have any specific questions, throughout anything, I'm here in the next couple of days, you can always ask me. I'm happy to help you. Can't promise that I have all the questions, but I maybe have some thoughts on it as well. Yeah. let me pray for us. And yeah, that's kind of like it for my First Peter. Yeah, God, I thank you so much for today, for this morning, for being able to be here with SBS in Atlanta. Lord, I thank you for all the things that you have, spoken to me during this time, and I just pray that this letter will, just really find a place in all of our hearts to become this encouragement that it's supposed to be, to become this message of hope that you intended it to be. And I just pray that where everyone is at in here, everyone is in different stages of life, goes through their different things, Lord, that you have something very specific for each of us in this letter that you want to be communicated. So, Lord, I just pray a blessing over today, over tomorrow, over our studies, knowing that you can encounter us in our studies and in these writings. God, we love you so much, and I just hope that you do something with this morning, that it will be somewhat maybe just encouraged, that you encourage us through this morning. In your name we pray. Amen.
I just want to encourage you to engage with God on the things that might be challenging in this book. Like, I don't know, when I was in SBS, and even still, sometimes I look at the small books and they're not small. But there's a lot in here that I know hits on things that some of you have been walking through. And not even just the obvious things like grief, but also like hardship in relationships with family and parents and siblings. Suffering takes all different forms. And I think the Lord wants to speak to you. I just think it's interesting, the word Whitney had this morning and this theme of hope coming through as Cedric was sharing. And I also want to encourage you to dig into this chapter 4 and not to be afraid of challenging what you've maybe been taught before and letting the Holy Spirit illuminate something new to you. And when it is a smaller book week, you have a little more time to sit with those things and to chew on them. So just encourage you to do that. Some announcements for today. The info about food trucks is in a message on Groupie if you're interested to go tomorrow. We have lunch ready for you now, and dinner will be at 5, and then you'll take taco stuff for tomorrow. And we did get a volunteer to serve with Grace, right? For dinner tonight? To take Ellie's spot? I know Anna asked for him. Did anybody? Yes. Okay. He's snoring. Okay, so your First Peter is due at 8 a.m. Wednesday morning, and we start class at 8 a.m. So make sure you give yourself a little buffer to get it in that folder over there.